Hello and Assalamu alaikum, dear students. Welcome to a new video of mine with a new lecture on a new topic. And our today's topic is Geoffrey Chaucer's contribution to English poetry. Before going into details, what is exactly the contribution of Geoffrey Chaucer towards the development of English poetry and English literature? Let's have an introduction to this topic. Chaucer is said to be the father of English poetry, in the sense that he gave many new things to English poetry and English literature that were totally absent from English poetry before him. For example, Geoffrey Chaucer gave realism, humor, narrative skill, meter, music, rhythm, etc. He also contributed to the versification and language of English poetry. Before Geoffrey Chaucer, all these things were, if at all there, they were in incomplete form. They were in fragmentary form. It was Geoffrey Chaucer who for the first time introduced all these things in a fullest manner, in a complete manner. He was the first genuine poet. He was the very first great poet who for the first time wrote great type of poetry having all these basic characteristics of English poetry. In this way, this contribution of Geoffrey Chaucer took English poetry from a common level to an extraordinary level, from an ordinary level to an extraordinary level, because of which Geoffrey Chaucer is said to be the father of English poetry. Keeping in mind this contribution of Geoffrey Chaucer towards the development of English poetry, Matthew Arnold, a Victorian critic, once said, "With him is born our great poetry." In other words, Matthew Arnold wants to say that with Geoffrey Chaucer is born true great English type of poetry. Before Geoffrey Chaucer, there were poets who did write poetry, but their poetry was not at all as great a type of poetry as was produced by Geoffrey Chaucer. So this is why Geoffrey Chaucer is called the father of English poetry. Not only the father of English poetry, but at the same time, he is said to be the grandfather of English novel and English drama much before their birth in 16th and 18th century English literature respectively. Now, this is the introduction to the topic. First important contribution of Geoffrey Chaucer is contribution to language. When Chaucer came into the field of writing English poetry, English language was thought to be an ordinary kind of a language. It was thought to be an inexpressive kind of a language, a poor kind of a language. And not only English literary personalities, but at the same time, ordinary people, they did not attach much of the importance to English poetry. It was Geoffrey Chaucer who for the first time made people realize the expressiveness, the communicative power of English poetry through his contribution to English language. When Chaucer came into the field of writing English poetry, English language was like a brick, and Chaucer touched it with his magic wand and he turned it into a marble, into something precious. Before Geoffrey Chaucer, English poetry was absolutely ordinary kind of a language. The moment he touched it with his magic stick, magic wand, he changed it into an extraordinary kind of a language, an uncommon kind of a language. When Geoffrey Chaucer started writing English poetry, English language was divided into four major dialects. Number one was Kentish dialect, number two was Midland dialect, number three was Southern dialect, number four was Northern dialect. These were the four major varieties of English language that existed at the time when Chaucer entered into the realm of writing English poetry. And out of these four varieties of English language, Chaucer selected the Midland dialect. Now, behind this selection of Midland dialect, there are quite a few reasons. Number one reason behind this selection was that Midland dialect was the language that was patronized by the courtly classes of the society, the royal classes of the society, because of which Chaucer went for the Midland dialect as a medium of expression of his poem, The Prologue to the Canterbury Tales. And Chaucer himself was a courtier. So it was quite natural for Chaucer to go for the language which is already a variety of English language which is already patronized by, favored by the royalty of the time. So this is the first important reason. Second important reason because of which Chaucer selected Midland dialect was it was popular with the literary personalities of the time. Literary personalities of the time, if at all they made use of English language in the writing of their works, they made use of this variety, which is called the Midland dialect, which Chaucer also selected for the writing of his poem, the Prologue to the Canterbury Tales. So this is the second important reason behind the selection of this variety of English language. Third important reason was that it was easy in grammar and syntax. It was simple in syntax, simple in structure, and it was simple in grammar, because of which Chaucer thought that it is the most appropriate version of English language, which is best suited to the type of poem which he intends to write in the form of the Prologue to the Canterbury Tales. So Chaucer selected Midland dialect for the writing of his poem because of these few reasons. And Midland dialect was the dialect which was spoken in London, which was spoken at the outskirts of especially London. So it was the language of the Londoners as well. So this is the location, the area with which it was popular. It was popular there in the outskirts of London. It was popular with the Londoners. So because of all these reasons, Chaucer selected Midland dialect out of the 4 varieties of English language. When Chaucer came into the field of writing poetry, English language was not only divided into 4 major dialects, but at the same time, it had a competition with 3 other languages that were far more popular, which were thought to be far more standard and expressive languages as compared to English language. And they were French language, Latin language, and Greek language. These 3 languages were the languages that were thought to be more popular, more expressive, more standard as compared to English language. And majority of the richer sections of the society, richer sections of England, they made their children either learn Greek or Latin or French language. They paid little attention towards English language. They completely overlooked English language as far as their interest in English language is concerned. So keeping in mind all these things, Chaucer goes for the least popular language, the least expressive language, at least thought to be least expressive language in his time, which was English language. And out of these 4 languages that existed in the times of Geoffrey Chaucer, Chaucer selects English language for the writing of his poem, the Prologue to the Canterbury Tales, and brought an idea in the minds of the people that English language is as expressive a language, as communicative a language as is French, Greek, or Latin language. And the moment Chaucer used this language, English language, for the writing of his poem, the Prologue to the Canterbury Tale, no other poet, future poet, thought of using any other language for the writing of their poems except English language. Future poets, they overlooked French, Greek, and Latin language after this contribution of Geoffrey Chaucer towards the development of English language. So in this way, Geoffrey Chaucer popularized English language, standardized English language, and he made it quite clear upon the future generations that English language is as standard a language, as popular language, as expressive and communicative a language as are the other languages of the world. Next important contribution of Geoffrey Chaucer towards the development of English poetry is contribution to versification. When Chaucer came into the field of writing English poetry, there was old versification, and this old versification had certain characteristics. At least 3 dominant characteristics were there in the old versification. First important characteristic of the old versification was that it had no end rhyme. Whenever the poets who wrote poetry in the past following this old versification, they did not make use of end rhyme, right? And they completely got rid of end rhyme in their poetry. Second important feature of this old versification was excessive use of alliteration. In the times of Geoffrey Chaucer, or before the times of Geoffrey Chaucer, poets used to use alliteration for decorative purposes, as there wasn't any regular meter in their poetry. So in order to compensate for the absence of meter in their regular meter in their poetry, they made use of alliteration to create sort of a music and rhythm in their poetry. So there was excessive use of alliteration in their poetry. This is the second important characteristic of the old versification. And third important characteristic of old versification is irregularity in the number of syllables in each line. Mean previous poets before Geoffrey Chaucer, when they wrote poetry, each line of their poetry had irregular number of syllables. For example, first line contains 10 syllables, next line contains 8 syllables, next line contains 6 syllables, next line contains 12 syllables. So this number of syllables in each line keeps on varying. Chaucer, did not do this in the writing of his poetry. So these were the three major characteristics of old versification that Chaucer totally overlooked while writing his poetry. Chaucer introduced a new kind of versification, which later on in modern times came to be called modern versification or Chaucerian versification. Chaucerian versification had three dominant characteristics. Number one was Chaucer introduced andrime. Number two was he got rid of excessive use of alliteration. Third important characteristic of Chaucerian versification was Chaucer introduced regularity in the number of syllables in each line. Right? So these are the characteristics of Chaucerian versification. The moment Chaucer made this contribution to the versification, there came the usage of meter in English poetry. So keeping in mind this usage of meter in English poetry, we can say that Geoffrey Chaucer introduced three dominant meters in English poetry. Number one was decasyllabic line, number two was octosyllabic line, number three was Chaucerian stanza. Decasyllabic line is in modern time is called as iambic pentameter. Octosyllabic line is called as iambic tetrameter, and Chaucerian stanza is also called as rhyme royal. So these are the three dominant meters, regular meters, introduced by Geoffrey Chaucer in his three important works like the Prologue to the Canterbury Tales, the Book of Duchess, and Troilus and Cressida. All these works are of Geoffrey Chaucer contain all these three meters. Decasyllabic line is the type of line which contains 10 syllables, 5 stressed and 5 unstressed. And octosyllabic line is the type of meter in which each line contains 8 syllables, 4 stressed and 4 unstressed. And Chaucerian stanza is 7-lined stanza in which each line contains 10 syllables with 5 stresses and 5 syllables are unstressed. So these are the meters that are introduced by Geoffrey Chaucer. The moment Chaucer introduced these meters in the writing of his poetry, there came music in his poetry. Because what is meter? Meter is the systematic arrangement of stressed and unstressed syllables. They are the systematic arrangement of stressed sounds and unstressed sounds, prominent sounds and less prominent sounds, right? So there is a systematic arrangement of them. When these sounds are systematically arranged, there comes music, right? So keeping in mind this contribution to music, introduction of music in English poetry, one of the critics said that reading Chaucer is like listening to a clear stream while sitting by it in a weather which is full of sunshine and which has a lot of greenery around it and all that. So this is the comment of the critic, which clearly proves that Geoffrey Chaucer immensely contributed towards the development of English versification, English meter, and all these things. So this is the next important contribution of Geoffrey Chaucer towards the development of English poetry. Next important contribution of Geoffrey Chaucer towards the development of English poetry is contribution to the subject matter of English poetry. Subject matter means the thought of English poetry, the theme of English poetry, the ideas of English poetry, the emotions of the English poetry, the soul of English poetry, the ideas of English poetry. The ideas of English poetry were totally different before Geoffrey Chaucer. Before Geoffrey Chaucer, English poetry was allegorical in nature, imaginary in nature, fantastic in nature. It was completely unrealistic in nature. It was completely out of touch with the real world and the real society of the real human beings. Everything in the poetry before Geoffrey Chaucer was unrealistic, fantastic and imaginary. Characters were imaginary, themes were imaginary, and places and settings and backgrounds were imaginary. Everything was unrealistic, fantastic and imaginary, 100 times removed from the basic realities of life that prevails in human society. Whereas Geoffrey Chaucer, the moment he came into the field of writing poetry, the moment he produced his poem at the age of 50 in the form of the Prologue to the Canterbury Tales, he introduced realism. He linked English poetry to real human beings, to real human society. He introduced real characters with real themes, with real settings and places. Take the example of his poem The Prologue to the Canterbury Tales. In the poem The Prologue to the Canterbury Tales, the characters are taken from 14th century England. They are not fantastic beings. They are knights, they are squires, they are prioresses, they are church characters, there are traders, there are merchants, there are lawyers, there are doctors. There are all these characters that actually existed in 14th century England. Even now they exist in our society with different names and with different labels. So Chaucer introduced real characters, and the themes Chaucer also introduced borrowed from the real life, and the settings and places are also taken from real English society. For example, he discusses Tabard and he discusses Canterbury area, right? The very title of the poem, Canterbury Tales, tells us that it is the real place. Canterbury area still exists in England, still is there in England in 21st century. So everything in Chaucer's poetry is quite realistic. So this is how he brought a sea change in the subject matter of English poetry. Before Geoffrey Chaucer, the subject matter of English poetry was fantastic, unrealistic, removed from real life. Chaucer introduced realistic subject matter based upon the lives of real human beings. Next important contribution that is made by Geoffrey Chaucer is towards English drama and novel, much before their births in 16th century and 18th century respectively. Novel is the product of 18th century and drama is the product of 16th century. Much before their birth in 14th century, Chaucer introduced elements of novel, elements of drama in his poem The Prologue to the Canterbury Tales, Troilus and Cressida, and some of the rest of the works, especially in his Prologue to the Canterbury Tales. There are at least 3 features of novel found in Prologue to the Canterbury Tales. Number 1 is lifelike characters. Number 2 is plot construction. Number 3 is narrative skill. These are the 3 things that are introduced by Geoffrey Chaucer in Prologue to the Canterbury Tales. His characters are lifelike characters taken from real life. This is also the case with novel. In novel, characters are also borrowed from real life. They are not fantastic beings, rather they are taken from real society. Then there is also plot construction or tendency to construct plot in Prologue to the Canterbury Tales. Some of the tales that are told by certain characters in Prologue to the Canterbury Tales, they have a proper plot in them. They have a proper beginning, proper middle, and proper end, very much like a proper plot, right? So one of the critics, while talking about his poem, The Troilus and Cressida, said that this poem has the proper plot of a novel. It has exposition, it has conflict, it has a rising action, it has a falling action, it has a denouement or resolution. All the basic elements of the plot of novel, the proper. While talking about this plot construction or presence of plot in Troilus and Cressida, the same critic once said that if Troilus and Cressida of Geoffrey Chaucer would have been written by Chaucer in prose, not in poetry, then this work, Troilus and Cressida, would have been considered as the first regular novel in the history of English literature and not Pamela by Samuel Richardson. Pamela is first regular novel written by 18th century novelist Samuel Richardson. This critic says that if Troilus and Cressida would have been written in prose, then Troilus and Cressida would have been regarded as the first regular novel in the history of English literature, not Pamela, the novel by Samuel Richardson. So this comment amply shows that how Chaucer made contribution, immensely contributed towards the development of, towards the birth of novel by the middle of 18th century. And along with this contribution to novel, Chaucer also contributes to the drama of the time. He also contributes to the development of birth of drama by the beginning of 16th century. There are at least quite a few characteristics of drama found in the poetry of Geoffrey Chaucer, especially Prologue to the Canterbury Tales. Number 1 is dramatic characterization. Number 2 is dialogue. Number 3 is plot construction. These things are there in regular drama, and these things are also there in the poetry of Geoffrey Chaucer, specifically his poem, The Prologue to the Canterbury Tales. There is clearly lifelike characters, dramatic characters in the Prologue to the Canterbury Tales. They are dramatic in the sense that they are self-revealing characters. They reveal themselves very much like dramatic characters through their dialogues, through their actions, through their movements, through their events and incidents in which they are involved. In this way, they are self-revealing characters. Dramatists also introduce characters, create characters that are dramatic. Mean there is no writer in between the character and the audience. Rather, character itself introduces himself to the audience. Same type of characterization is there in the prologue to the Canterbury Tales, especially in the Canterbury Tales. Next important dramatic element is the balance between the speech of the character and the nature of the character. In prologue to the Canterbury Tales, there are characters who tell tales, and those tales show the nature of their narrators, very much like dramatic characters, as dramatic characters speak such dialogue which reflect their nature. In the same way, the characters in prologue to the Canterbury Tales, they tell tales that throw some sort of light upon their inner self, upon their past life, upon their nature, upon their mind and heart. So there is a kind of a balance between the nature of a character and these dialogue that is normally associated with the dramatic characters. Next important dramatic feature that is found in prologue to the Canterbury Tales is plot construction. Very much like a drama, it has proper plot construction, proper beginning, proper middle, and proper end. So Chaucer, in this way, much before the birth of drama, by the middle of 16th century, in the form of Gorboduc and Ralph Roister Doister, he contributes towards the birth of novel. He tells the future generations of the writers how to write drama having all these elements. So this is it for today. I hope you would understand each and everything that I've shared with you in my today's lecture related to today's topic. Thank you very much. Allah Hafiz.